Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. My name is Allie, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in August. I ended up reading 11 books in the month of August. This was a really great reading month. I'm super proud of myself. And I also read 3 books that I physically own, which I'm also pretty proud about. If you've been watching my videos as of late, I have been trying to read more from my physical TBR, physical shelves. And I think I did a pretty good job of that this month. I mean, it definitely wasn't the majority of the books that I read, but I made an effort. So without further ado, let's get right on into the first book that I read in the month of August, and that is In My Dreams I Hold a Knife by Ashley Winstead. This book, I went between giving it a 3 and a 4-star rating. I kind of settled on a halfway point, 3.5, and I ended up rounding it up to 4. This is kind of a dark academia meets psychological thriller. I really enjoyed it, and I ended up reading it kind of like audiobook and physically at the same time, so that was a really interesting experience. Basically, this follows 6 people who were friends in college, but a murder ended up happening while they were at college, and it kind of splintered them, and they ended up going in all different directions. But now they are back for a school reunion, and the brother of the murdered friend is wanting to figure out what happened and really wants to get down to it during this school reunion. So this is a really interesting premise. I really did enjoy it. I think that there were a few things that just like did not work for me. They weren't really anything big or anything problematic. I felt like there were some like pacing issues, some point of view issues, but ultimately they didn't really detract too much from my enjoyment of this book. I think if you're really new to both the thriller genre and also dark academia, I think this one will really work for you. For me, it was like I enjoyed it, but it wasn't the best book that I've ever read, so I kind of felt like 3.5 was a pretty fair rating. I really wish that Goodreads would give half-star ratings. Thankfully, we have Storygraph. The next book that I ended up reading was my first 5-star of the month, and that is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. And it feels like I read this book literally years ago. For some reason, August was like so long, but also so short. Also, this was kind of a book where I was not expecting to absolutely love this book. When I first picked it up, I will say that I did expect to really enjoy it, but then as time went on and I heard more people's opinions about this book, I kind of felt like, okay, maybe it's not going to be like the best book I've ever read, but who knows, maybe I'll still enjoy it. And then I kind of got to that space where I was like, maybe I'm really not going to like this book. But then I decided to just pick it up and do a reading vlog about it, and surprise surprise, I ended up absolutely loving this book. This book absolutely does have a lot of issues, some problematic elements, so I would recommend looking at the trigger warnings for this book and maybe reading some reviews. I will also leave down below the article that I read about Ottessa Moshfegh and her writing and some of the problematic elements that pop up a lot in her writing, because I think that it's a really important article to read. I think it really puts a lot of her work into context, and I mean, I feel like we can all decide what books that we want to read, and I did really enjoy this one. I was very surprised, and I'm so glad that I ended up reading it. I read it fully physically, which was just so much fun. I feel like maybe if I had read it as an audiobook, it might have detracted a little bit from my enjoyment, but thankfully I decided to go full physical with this one, and I absolutely loved it. The next book that I ended up reading was The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. This is the first book from Joan Didion that I've ever read, and I think I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars or 5 out of 5 stars, something like that. I did really enjoy it, and the ending really made me cry. I feel like if you've experienced any kind of loss or have ever grieved over someone in your life, this is gonna be a really hard-hitting book for you. So maybe if like the grief is really fresh, this might not be the book for you, but I personally really enjoyed it. And basically this book follows Joan Didion's year after the death of her husband, all of the aftermath of that, the kind of loss that she experienced, and also dealing with her daughter's illness and her being in and out of the hospital. So it was a really, really hard-hitting book, and I highly, highly recommend it, and I cannot wait to read more from Joan Didion. Okay, now on to the audiobooks that I do not own physically. The first one of those I read, Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho, and I was really glad that I ended up reading this. It talks a lot specifically about anti-Black racism, and I found it to be really, really interesting and engaging. I would highly recommend it to people who are just now trying to unpack and unlearn their anti-Black biases, because it really does take you step by step through uncomfortable questions that you might have, or uncomfortable conversations that you just don't think that you can broach the topic in person. I think that this is a really great way to kind of get some of that anti-Black bias out and have a conversation about it and hear his perspective on it. And I think that this book is a really, really great tool for that, so I do highly recommend it. The next book that I ended up reading is one that I feel like everybody read in the month of August, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. I ended up getting the audio arc, I don't remember what those are called, but I ended up getting one of those from Libro FM, and I was so excited because I'm like, I don't know how I'm gonna read this book otherwise. I had a feeling that it'd be super, super popular, that I would not be able to get my hands on it, and I feel like the Libro FM audiobook arcs were like the only way that was gonna happen, so I'm so glad that it was available for August. And honestly, this book was really, really hard to read. Not necessarily in the fact that like, oh, it was like so complexly written that it was hard to read, but it was just like the actual content of the book was really hard to read. It really goes into detail of the abuse that she experienced from her mom, and then also a lot of the abuse and the way that she was taken advantage of within the Nickelodeon network. So it's definitely a really hard book to read, very hard-hitting, very sad, honestly. A lot of people are like, how is this book even funny? Like, how are people who are reviewing it saying that it's funny? And I kind of agree with that, because like, I don't know how it's seen as funny. I didn't really laugh when I read it. But I did honestly really enjoy getting to hear from Jennette McCurdy, hearing her side, hearing the things that she experienced. And honestly, she did a really, really good job at expressing her feelings and everything that just kind of happened within her life. I'm always really impressed by people who can write a memoir, because I'm like, I don't think I'd be able to remember all of that. But I ended up not rating this book. This is like the first memoir that I have not rated, and it's mainly because I just like felt so uncomfortable trying to put a star rating on this book. But I think that if I could, I'd probably give it a 5. Because I really enjoyed it. The next book that I read, I did not enjoy nearly as much as any of the other books that I read this month, and that was Finlay Donovan is Killing It by Elle Cosimano. And I really, really did not like this book, unfortunately. I went in thinking that I was gonna love it. I was thinking like, oh, this is gonna be right up my alley. This is gonna be so much fun. I'm gonna have such a great time reading it. But unfortunately, I really genuinely hated this book so much. I probably should have given it a 1 star. I think I gave it 2 stars, and I was being very generous. And mainly for me, what it came down to was the fact that the main character was just so ridiculously and unbelievably naive. I wish I had written a review for this book, but I think I was so angry at the time that I just could not formulate words. But I do have some updates from when I was reading it, and the first update, literally the first update that I made about this book says, why is this 4-year-old talking like a 16-year-old with a baby voice? Which is a huge gripe for me when it comes to adult literature. So many adult writers don't know how to write children. Like, it just, they cannot write children accurately. It's so, so weird to me, and I immediately catch it every time I read an adult literature book. I would say probably 75% of the time they do not know how to write kids. I remember this plainly from Little Fires Everywhere. I remember reading that book and I'm like, no teenager would ever say any of the things that were said in that book. It was very unsettling. The next update was at about 29% of the way into the book, and basically, if you've read this book, you'll know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, then you can totally just skip this part. But basically I said, so confused why Finlay went through hiding the body and making a deal with Vera, or whoever like her accomplice was. Her accomplice was basically the nanny that had been fired by her ex-husband. I don't actually know what her name was, because every time the narrator said this character's name, it sounded different to me. So I could never really figure out what her name was. So we'll just say the babysitter. But yeah, making a deal with the babysitter, all to make it seem like it was obvious she wouldn't meet up with the wife who hired her for the hit. So basically what was going on was that this woman, so the main character Finlay is an author. I think she writes like romantic thrillers, and she was talking to, I believe, her agent in a Panera, and a woman overheard their conversation and thought that she was talking about a hit that she had done, like that Finlay was a hitman or something. And so this woman asks her to kill her husband, and Finlay kind of ends up going through with it a little bit, but she's kind of like bumbling. She's so naive that she just accidentally kills him, and it's so quirky and weird, and like, oh, I'm so weird and quirky, like I just accidentally killed somebody. And then she ends up bringing the babysitter in as kind of an accomplice, and they decide, okay, this guy's already dead, we might as well go through with the hit and collect the money from the wife. Like, let's just go through with it. They got it all, you know, we got it all figured out, the deal is done. And then literally the next day, when it comes time to tell the wife that like they did the hit, like he's dead, everything's good, for some reason Finlay has like just decided that she never actually decided to go tell the wife. Like, she never actually made that deal with the babysitter. She now seems appalled that the babysitter would even fathom the thought of her going to tell the wife. It comes completely out of left field. I'm like, did you not just the night before decide, like, done deal? Why are we walking that back? Why are we acting like we never decided that? Like, why is she being weird about it? I thought the whole point of her deciding to hide the body was to get the money. Like, where's the connection for that? It just doesn't make sense to me. And so many instances in this book are just like that, where the character will kind of decide something and then a few pages later act like she never made that decision. And I'm like, what's going on? Is this an author thing? Does she think that she's making like a really interesting plot? I don't know what she's doing. I don't know what like the idea behind this indecision is. It's very weird. And then my very last update for this book is boo, tomato, tomato, throwing tomatoes. Like, this book just made me so unreasonably angry, and I'm really glad that I didn't ever buy it, you know, physically. So I guess that was kind of a win for me. If you enjoyed that book, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to like completely bash it, but I just genuinely did not like this book. The next book that I read was much better, and that was The Princess Trap by Talia Hibbert. I absolutely love this. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. It was very steamy, very spicy, but it was so much fun, and I really enjoyed it. And I think that Talia Hibbert just knocks it out of the park every time she writes a plus size heroine. She just absolutely kills it, and she is one of the only non-fat people that I trust writing fat people. Like, she kills it every time. The next book that I read in the month of August was Fever Dream by Samantha Schweblin, and I gave this book a 3.5 out of 5 stars. This is a horror book. It definitely leans towards like social commentary horror. It's also a translated book, so if you're interested in reading translated works, this one would be perfect for you, especially if you are like a true blue horror fan. I think this would be a lot of fun. It's not necessarily like gruesome or anything, but it is definitely weird. I don't know if speculative would be the correct term for it, but it kind of feels right in my heart, so we're gonna go with that. I was pretty middling with this book, but I think that I did ultimately enjoy it. It just wasn't one of my favorites. The next book that I read was Eva Luna by Isabel Allende, another translated work, and I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars, and I definitely want to read more from Isabel Allende in the future, hopefully in the near future. This book was absolutely gorgeous and breathtaking. The storytelling was fantastic, and it definitely is, it feels a lot like the character of Eva Luna. She is like telling you the story, you know, years after it's happened, and she's looking back on her life, and it's just so much fun and so beautiful, and like there's so many things that happen, and you would think that it would get bogged down by so many plot lines, but honestly they weave together so perfectly that it just feels really natural. So I did really enjoy that book. I highly recommend it, though I would check the trigger warnings. I would say watch out for misogyny, for some racism, for some trans misogyny and transphobia. Definitely a lot of those. I think some violence as well. So yeah, just make sure to check the trigger warnings for this book before going into it. The second to last book that I read for the month of August was Nevada by Imogen Binnie, and this is a book about a trans woman, and she is kind of stuck at this dead-end job working at a bookstore in New York, and she ends up getting fired from this job and decides to go on a road trip all the way to Nevada. And once she gets there, she ends up meeting this boy who works at a Walmart, and she has this inkling that he might also be trans, and it just kind of explores her life, her relationship to her trans identity, and it also explores her experience with this other boy who lives in Nevada and might also be trans. This definitely is a really interesting, kind of messy queer exploration kind of book, and I really did enjoy it. It was a really great audiobook. I believe possibly the author might have narrated it, but I can't remember. But I did really enjoy this book. I think I might have given it a 4 or 5 star rating. I can't remember. Yes, I ended up giving it 5 stars, and I highly recommend it. I think, you know, if you're looking for some more messy queer stories, this is definitely one that you should check out. I would love to see more queer narratives that are similar to this, because I just thought this one, like, it definitely reminds me of those like very messy straight kind of stories, like My Year of Rest and Relaxation, or like a Sally Rooney book. You know, those books get to be messy and complicated and weird, and I feel like a lot of times queer stories have to be a bit more sanitized, so this one was definitely very refreshing. And the very last book that I read in August was Tender is the Flesh by Augustina Bastarrica, and I ended up giving this book a 3 out of 5 stars. This one is also another translated horror book. I have been seeing this book so many times across like YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. I've seen it literally everywhere, so I've been wanting to read this book for quite a while, and I'm really glad that I ended up picking it up finally. Would I say that I absolutely loved this book? No, but I have really been trying to figure out my niche within the horror genre. I think that I definitely lean more towards gothic horror rather than just like speculative horror or straight up horror. But this was definitely a fun book to try out, you know, like have that sort of trial and error. This book is all about cannibalism. Basically, there's an illness that affected all of these animals, specifically like animals that we consume, but I think it also affected animals that we don't consume. So basically it just affects all animals, and they are no longer able to be like pets or at the zoo or used for food. So instead we have to rely on cannibalism, and that becomes illegal. So the main character of this book works at this facility that basically takes humans and I believe breeds them to be used as meat. This is definitely a book that where if that makes your stomach queasy to the point where you don't think you'd be able to read it, don't read it, don't bother. It's not like a super special horror book, at least in my opinion, though take that with a grain of salt because I don't read a lot of horror. I've only read probably like 2 handfuls worth of horror books in my life. I definitely want to read more, so if you have recommendations, go ahead and leave them down below. But just take my opinion on this book with a grain of salt. I did really enjoy it. I felt like there were some really slow parts. I felt like there were some moments where I just was not engaged with the story. For me personally, I feel like I would have wanted just a bit more. I would have wanted it to go a little bit further, a little bit more disturbing. For me, it just didn't really hit the mark. It didn't go far enough. And I also feel like it should have followed a different character. I just felt like the main character was a little dry, a little flat. And I think that I've definitely experienced that with a lot of horror books that I've read. Just from like my very rudimentary experience with horror, I feel like a lot of horror authors tend to focus more on the plot or more on the spooky elements instead of focusing on the character, which as a character-driven reader, that is really difficult for me because I need a strong main character in order to get me engaged with a story. And with horror, that's kind of a hit or miss sort of thing, so it makes reading those books a little bit more difficult. So yeah, that's kind of like my entire thought process about Tenders of Flesh. Otherwise, I did find it to be really interesting, and I would recommend it if you are a really big horror fan. You might really enjoy it, but for me it just didn't work as well as I wanted it to. It's really, really hot right now, and I definitely want to get this wrapped up, so that was the end of my August wrap up. I'm so excited. I read 11 books that month. Like, that's just like really great for me. I feel very, very confident about that. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. Let me know down below in the comments what books that you read in August. And also if you read horror, especially gothic horror, let me know some recommendations down below. And also don't forget to subscribe to my channel and give me a thumbs up. And if you want to connect with me more, you can follow me on Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Storygraph, TikTok. All the links will be down below, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye! Ooh,